Hi, today we will be covering Chapter 14, Support and Movements in Humans and Animals, 14.1 and 14.2. This will be based on your textbook and some notes from another reference book. So yeah. We'll start off with 14.1. So there are 3 types of skeletons. The first one I will talk about is exoskeleton. So exoskeleton has a hard covering deposited on the animal surface. Let's use pink. Okay. Hard covering deposited on animal surface, and it supports and protects the body organs and enable movements. So mollusk, for example, your snail has an exoskeleton. So this shell is the exoskeleton, and it is made up of calcium carbonate, which is also, an ingredient of chalk. So snail is brittle, sunang pecah. Other than that, there are insects and arthropods, which has cuticle, consists of chitin. And chitin is a non-living structure, so it is incapable of growth. For example, you see like a grasshopper. When it is still young, the skeleton is quite soft actually. It doesn't actually have the proper exoskeleton. So when they grow in size, the exoskeleton hardens. So when it dies, that's why you still have that shell left out, but it's hollow. The insides is gone because it's, hancho. Melt away? I forgot the proper term. Right? So that's exoskeleton. Next would be a hydrostatic skeleton. So hydrostatic skeleton is formed by fluid-filled compartments within the body cavity, and the fluid is held under pressure in compartments surrounded by muscles. So the muscles are used to move the fluid within the segmented body cavity to control movement. So your worm. So if you actually see a worm properly, this is the head, and they have the ring part of it as well. And then you have the body, and you have the end. So that's what segmented means. They have different segments of the body. And lastly, the endoskeleton. So we have an endoskeleton. It is a hardened internal skeleton within soft tissues, and chordates have bones and cartilage to which muscles are attached. The mammalian skeleton contains bones connected at joints by ligaments that allow freedom of movement. Alright, so those are the 3 types of skeletons: exo, endo, and hydrostatic. So the necessity of skeletons is to provide shape and supports the body, which is why all of the living things have different shapes and different squishiness, for the lack of better words, and supports that shape of the body. And it provides surfaces for muscle attachment to facilitate movement, stores and releases minerals such as calcium and phosphorus, produces blood cells. So this is where your erythrocytes are produced. And lastly, protects vital organs such as the brain, which is encased in a skull, your heart, which is behind the rib cage, and your lungs as well, right? Right, and that is the end of 14.1. So we will go to 14.2. We will start with the axial skeleton. So this is on page 267 of your textbook. The axial skeleton is in mint color, I guess. So you have your skull. This is your skull. And you have your, what is this actually? You have your rib cage. This is your rib cage. And sternum. Your sternum would be this one, right? Sternum. Oh, let's make a straight line. Okay. I love technology. Okay, sternum. And lastly, your apa nama to? Vertebral column. Vertebral column. Right, that's your axial skeleton. And your appendicular skeleton, mainly 4 parts. So this is your pectoral girdle. And then, yeah, your pectoral girdle is made up of your clavicle. So clavicle is your collarbones, right? Clavicle. And your scapula. This is your scapula. It's all this happens. Scapula. And then next would be your pelvic girdle. And your pelvic girdle consists of the ilium. This is your ilium. Do not be confused with ilium. This is another one. So when someone says ilium, make sure you know what the context is, right? And this is your pubis. So your pubis, also known as the pubic bone, and your ischium. Yeah, ischium. Ischium. I don't know, man. Yeah, ischium. As long as you know how it is spelled, right? So your pelvic girdle, we'll move on to the upper limb. So the upper limb, you have your humerus. And then you have your ulna, radius, carpal, metacarpals, and your phalanges. So I won't label that part because it's a lot, so please remember. Your radius would be the front part, and your ulna would be the back part, right? And then lastly would be your lower limb. So femur, the main one, femur. This is the bone in your thighs. And then you have your patella for your knee, your tibia, fibula, tarsals, metatarsals, and your phalanges, your lower limb phalanges. So that's the appendicular skeleton. So if you want a different way to memorize all of this, you have the Bone Song by Hannah Montana / Miley Cyrus. You can look that up. I survived my Form 4, Form 5 back then by memorizing that song. Surprisingly hopeful. So yeah, a tip. Bone Song by Hannah Montana or Miley Cyrus. No, Miley Smiley? No, I don't know. The other one. Miley something. Right, next. We will talk about the human vertebral column. This is on page 268, 269. So we have 5 main columns. So your vertical, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, and your coccyx or your caudal. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae, C1 to C7, 12 thoracic vertebrae, T1 to T12, 5 lumbar vertebrae, L1 to L5, and then you have your 5 vertebrae or bones fused together to create a triangle, which is the sacral, and here, sacral, the big part, and your caudal will be 4 vertebrae fused together. Still very small. So this is your tailbone, right? It is called the caudal vertebrae, or the coccyx, or the tailbone, right? 5 different columns. We'll start with the cervical vertebrae, which is the first part. You have your atlas vertebra, which is the first vertical vertebra. And articulates with the skull, which means it is connected to the skull. So it has a large neural cavity right here, because if you remember how your brain looks like from chapter 13 ka 12? Chapter 12, I think. Yeah, chapter 12. Yeah, Rabbi, where is it? There's that medulla oblongata, right? So that's where it goes through, the medulla oblongata, to the neural cord. Neural cord? That doesn't sound right. The nerve cord. Nervous cord? Sorry. Yeah. You'll know what I say. Yeah, this is connected to the chapter 12 of the brain, right? So it articulates with the skull and has a large neural canal, small spinous process, and a pair of transverse foramina with no centrum. So you have your transverse foramen here and another foramen here, which makes foramen here, which makes the foramina, right? Next, we will have the axial vertebra. The axial vertebra is the second cervical vertebra with an odontoid process. So an odontoid process is this thing. It's quite flat, right? That articulates with the facet of the atlas vertebra's neural canal. Ooh. So over here. So mana dia? Okay, so this is connected to this part, right? So it's like a puzzle, basically. It still has a large spinous process. The spinous process is here. And then a small transverse process and a pair of transverse foramina. The canal is still quite large, right? And lastly, the cervical vertebra itself, they have short spinous process. So this one, quite pendek. And then a small centrum. This is where, when you eat, what is that thing called? Bone marrow. Yeah, there we go. Inside is bone marrow as well. There's bone marrow. That's why you see macam dot spongy like that, right? And it has a wide and short transverse process and a pair of transverse foramina. So you have your pair right here, right? That's your cervical vertebrae. And moving on, we'll go to thoracic vertebrae. So the thoracic vertebrae is your T1 to T12, has a long spinous process. So that's what you have here. Whew, that's pretty long, right? And transverse processes have facets for articulation with the ribs. So they have transverse connection to be connected to the ribs, except for T1 and T12, because you don't have proper ribs over there, right? You only have a few set of ribs. You can Google how many that is. And you also have floating ribs. There you go. So yes, these transverse processes connects to the ribs. And lastly, the spinous and transverse processes serve as attachment sites for muscles and ligaments as well. Next, your lumbar vertebrae. It is your biggest and strongest vertebrae. It has a short spinous process. It's still long over here, but it's quite short compared to your thoracic vertebrae. But it has a large centrum. So large centrum to bear the weight of the lower back of the body. And lastly, your sacral and your caudal vertebrae, right? So your sacral has a process for articulation with the last lumbar vertebra over here. So your L5, yes, your L5 will be, is connected the right word? It won't connected. Macam you present lah, like bukan present. If you can imagine L5 is one person and the sacral is another person, you imagine them facing one another with no social distancing, like literally face each other with a, for the lack of better phrase, sexual tension, right? Very close to each other. They're not really connected like surface to surface, but like, you know, connected-ish. I don't know. You see on page 268, you know, L5 and your sacrum, there's still a space there. It's not like super connected. I hope you get what I mean. If you don't, just ask me a question, right? So lastly, your caudal, also known as the coccyx, and is pointed at what end? This is where it is pointed. So in your sacral, before we move on, in your sacral vertebrae, you have passage for the nerves and blood vessels. These are like mini holes, right? For your nerves and your blood vessels. Yes. Oh my god. The spinal nerves. That was what lambat kita. Okay, anyway. So we are done with the vertebral column. Next, we will compare and contrast. This is a direct copy from your text page on 269. Similarities between vertebrae would be that they all have spinous and transverse process, a centrum, and a neural canal. Excuse me. So like I said, there is no centrum in the atlas vertebra to accommodate the connection of the brain to the spinal nerves. There we go. Alright. And next would be the differences between your vertebrae, your cervical, your thoracic, and your lumbar. Right? So like I said, there are 5 columns, but the 2 last vertebrae, which is the sacral and the caudal, because they are fused vertebrae, they're not really talked much about in your syllabus. So we'll just focus on these 3 vertebrae when you're talking about the differences. Alright, you can just read that. They're very short. Okay. Right, moving on to the joints. So the definition of joints is the place where 2 or more bones meet. And for better words would be points where 2 or more bones meet, or cartilage and bones meet. So include this one, cartilage and bones meet, right? So there are 3 different types of joints. The first one would be immovable joints, which do not allow movement, and where bones, immovable joints, where bones are held together by fibrous connective tissue. So your skull has immovable joints. So all these sutures actually in your skull, right? These are immovable joints. Yeah, immovable joints held together by fibrous connective tissue. And next would be slightly movable joints, which is connected by cartilage. So your spine, your vertebrae, right? All of this have like in between would have cartilage disc. Those are slightly movable joints. Those are called slightly movable joints. And lastly, our freely movable joints. So freely movable joints, but are they more common? They're sort of more common in different parts of the body where you are able to move freely. So when you hear people talk about improving mobility, or when you see people exercising and they say start with activating your mobility, this is where your freely movable joints take part, and it is very important for them to be, quote unquote, fresh and young. Right? So 2 bones are separated by a cavity filled with synovial fluid. This is synovial fluid. And the capsule is fibrous tissue that encloses and provides protection to bones. So you have your capsule here as well. And cartilage cushions the joint by absorbing shocks, reducing friction between the bone ends. So it protects bone from wearing out. So in old people, when they say, my knee hurts, this is where the cartilage has worn out, I guess. So the bones are actually, rubbing against each other, which is very painful. If you have like an old bicycle and you try to move the head and it goes, that's when they're rubbing against each other. You imagine that on your knees. You can imagine how painful it could be, right? So cartilage, very important for it to be present. Next would be the synovial membrane. So synovial membrane would be this, and your synovial fluid, which is the lubricant that reduces friction between ends of bones. So freely movable joints. 2 examples. The first one would be your ball and socket joint. So this is the ball, this is the socket. So the ball and socket joint allows rotational movement in all directions. So your arm and leg are able to swing in circular motions. So examples would be your shoulder joints between your humerus and pectoral girdle. So your humerus would be a part of your arm, and your pectoral girdle would be your clavicle and that scapula, right? And the next example would be hip joint. So this is a hip joint. This is your femur, and this is your pelvic girdle. So ball and socket joint. And the second example would be a hinge joint. So your knee. So a hinge joint allows movements of bones in one plane. So one plane would be either up and down or left to right. So an or, not and, right? A-N-D. So one plane only. If you remember maths, they talk about plane, and when you have the different points, and then I think you know what I mean, right? So examples of hinge joint would be your lower leg, where it can swing back and forth. When you sit down, you can swing it back and forth. And your elbow, where you can, when you rest your elbow on a table, right, you can move your forearm down and up, so that is the hinge joint, and phalanges of the fingers and toes. So your fingers are, they you know, they can only move up and down. It cannot move left to right. Of course you can move your fingers left to right, but that's not your phalanges moving, that is your metacarpals moving. So yeah, I think this would be better with a video, but that's fine. We'll cover it again when we have the time. Right, so hinge joint. And lastly, we have come to the conclusion of 14.2, and that would be support and movement also depends on skeletal muscles, tendons, and ligaments. So skeletal muscle comprise of muscle fibers with a large supply of nerves and blood vessels. And an important features of muscles is that antagonistic muscles exist. They work in pairs and in opposite direction. So there is an example on page 272 where they talk about an extensor and a flexor. When we see each other in Google Meet, we'll talk about this quite briefly, so if you are still confused. And also movement and locomotion will cover this, so the next lesson, most definitely. Secondly, the tendon. So the tendon connects bone to muscle, and it consists of long fibers which are not elastic but flexible. And lastly, the ligament. The ligament connects bone to bone and consists of strong, elastic, and tough connective tissue bundles. It provides support and strength to joints. So this is the important one, right? Provides support and strength to joints and allows bones to bend and the joints to bend at the joints. Sorry. At. Sorry, typo. Right. And that is the end of 14.2. This video is about 30 minutes. I hope you can watch all of it, so we can move on to 14.3 next class, 14.3 and 14.4, and finish the syllabus on Friday, so we can start revision and we can start going over certain experiments that you need to do. So yeah, if you have any question, just send it through Telegram. Yeah, thanks.